Okay, today we're going to be looking at completing the square in this video. This is a technique that's usually used in the second part of the quadratics unit. And it's used when you can't factor, but you still need to find the vertex of a quadratic equation. So I'll show you an example. Let's say I was asked to find vertex of this quadratic, y is equal to 2x squared minus 4x plus 5. Looking at my other videos, you'll see the product and sum tree that I've shown in those videos set up right here. And if you look, this time we have a product of 10 and we need to find two numbers that multiply to 10 and add to negative 4. And unfortunately, there are no two numbers that work. 1 and 10 can't get to negative 4, and 2 and 5 can't get to negative 4. So we cannot use the product and sum tree in this case. So we'd have to have another technique to find our vertex, and that's where completing the square comes in. So this is the way that I teach how to complete the square. There are many different techniques out there, but again, I find that this is the technique that students tend to make the least mistakes with. So the first thing I get my students to do is to spread things out a little bit. That 5 isn't going to participate in the completing the square, so I'm going to put it off to the side a little bit here. And at that point, I would also get them to put brackets around the first two terms, because those are the two terms that we're going to be working with. The plus 5 is just going to be an observer in this case. The first step is then to factor out any coefficient of x squared besides 1 that you might have in front of the x squared term. So you have to factor it out of both terms that are in the bracket. That's basically just dividing it out. So the 2 would come out in front, and we'd have 2 times x squared minus 2x plus 5 as the observer outside of the bracket. Keeping the x squared minus 2x in the bracket, again, is just focusing in on that part of what we're going to be doing. At this step, what you have to do is figure out a number that you're going to put into the bracket right here in order to be able to have a factorable trinomial. That number then has to be immediately added and subtracted in this position. In order to find that number, take the middle term number, or coefficient here, negative 2, off to the side, divide it by 2, and square it. And what we're actually doing here is we're creating a situation where we're going to have a perfect square trinomial show up in our bracket. So the number that we get is negative 2 divided by 2, which is negative 1. Negative 1 squared is positive 1. So as I said, we're now going to take that positive 1. We're going to add it and subtract it inside the bracket, keeping the plus 5 as an observer. Now, this adding and subtracting of the negative 1 is a concept that students tend to kind of have difficulty understanding. They don't get the point of adding something and then immediately subtracting it into the bracket, because obviously we're just adding 0. But the idea is, and a teacher would be able to explain this in a lot more detail than I want to do in the video, but the idea is that we have now formed a trinomial here that is factorable. So that trinomial is actually going to become a perfect square trinomial that we can then factor. Everything else is going to stay the same. And when you factor a perfect square trinomial, if I do the product and sum tree off to the side here of these 3 terms only, my product is 1, my sum is negative 2, I need two numbers that multiply to 1 and add to -2, which would be -1 and -1. And that -1 goes right here because it's x minus 1 times x minus 1, which gives me x minus 1 squared. Those two brackets that you would get from factoring the x squared minus 2x plus 1 are exactly the same. They're both x minus 1. So x minus 1 squared. What's interesting is that this number, -1, will always match the number that you got up here when you divided the -2 by 2. So it's kind of a way of skipping having to do the product and sum here. We don't need this product and sum because we know that the answer is going to be the -1 that we had up here anyway. At this step, we're almost done. We just need to clean up the final equation a little bit. So we have a 2 out in front that's going to distribute itself inside the bracket to both the x minus 1 squared bracket and to the other term inside that bracket, which is a -1. It's important to note that the 2 is not going to multiply inside the x minus 1 squared bracket. So it's just going to be multiplying the outside of that bracket. Because the bracket is squared, the 2 cannot go into the bracket. So it can just multiply to the front of the bracket. And then the 2 times the -1 would give me -2. I still have that +5, and I've eliminated that secondary bracket that was there. And at this step, I would just clean up -2 plus 5, which gives +3. So my final equation is y is equal to 2 times x minus 1 squared plus 3. And this is what we call vertex form of an equation, which we use these variables to represent the different stages of that equation. The A is the coefficient that controls how wide or how thin and whether the parabola is opening up or opening down. The H controls whether the vertex has moved left or right, and the K controls whether the vertex has moved up or down. So my vertex in this case, which is what I was looking for right at the beginning, is the value of H and K, which would be 1 and 3. And that's how you complete the square.